Good. Nick Bolton, the one and only. Actually, I had some interesting YouTube moment today where randomly I was in a video and the guy mentioned Nick Bolton was a very different Nick Bolton in a very different context. So I'll say the one and only Nick Bolton as he sits before me. Thank you very much for being on the podcast. It's been a long time coming. I'll let you say hello first.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, there is another Nick Bolton. I don't know if it's the same one you're talking about, but he's a bodybuilder. And I have to say that he's got a different kind of body than I have. Very impressive. But yeah, thank you, Yannick. I'm looking forward to this. I'm looking forward to diving into what we mean by transformative coaching and the whole kit and caboodle.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we could talk about a lot of different things, but today we're here to talk about new ideas on new perspectives on established ideas is how you put it, I think, which I really, really liked. Really diving into the perspective of Animas as a school, but of you as a person, something that I really, really enjoyed. You've done a lecture series of 6 lectures on how you see transformative coaching. And for a long time, you've been thinking about what is transformation. We had conversations about transformational dialogue, and it really helped me put things in perspective. So I'm really happy to dig into this. It was a long time coming, and it would have come anyway, but it got sparked by actually our last guest we had on the podcast, Simon Western, who did a LinkedIn post that went quite viral, I think. I asked him the question that I often did on this season of the podcast, what's your perspective on transformation? Instead of answering, he questioned the question. And I think both of us, through listening to that, we're like, well, I think it's going to be important that people get a sense for what we mean here when we talk about transformative coaching. And so I'm looking forward to bringing that into this format because it's not a lecture. People don't need all the time, but I really encourage everybody to go out there and really dig a little bit deeper, not just in your perspective, but I think what I want here is that people question their own perspective on transformational coaching and transformative coaching and what it actually means. So that's why we're here. Let's dig into it. I think what will be helpful, most people at Animas will know you, but people who don't know you, who might have just landed here randomly, welcome. But I think it's important to get a bit of an understanding where you are talking from. How do you introduce yourself?
That's such a big question, isn't it? How do you introduce yourself? But for the context of this conversation, I've been a coach for nigh on 20 years. I first started coaching in the very early 2000s, trained for the first time formally in 2006, classic grow model coaching. And so when I first started my own coaching school, which was 2008, I kind of ran with that baton of performance-based coaching, and I called it the SMART School, of course, after the SMART acronym. And then around about 2013, I started to really, well, to be honest, quite quickly, I started to question that underlying premise, but it took me another 5 years to really go, hold on, enough's enough. I need to rethink what my school's are about. And I took a big step back, and I asked myself, and also I asked my community, what do we really stand for as coaches? What does coaching really do, rather than what we think we do or say we do? And the thing that came out through a process of dialogue with them, and also just reflecting deeply on it for myself, was we help people face the truth. It's not about coaching. Is not about sugarcoating anything. It's about what is actually true. What do I want instead? And how do I begin to move towards that new thing? But also, what part is my responsibility cognitively as well as behaviorally in my current circumstance, as well as what I want to move towards? And so I got fascinated by the mental shift that had to happen that would be aligned with and enable the behavioral shift. And so I kind of thought about what lies behind that. And for me, it was courage. I think you've got to be very courageous to face the truth, and also courageous to move away from the existing reality. And so I came up with this concept, which was anima, which is life in Latin, and animas, which is the seat of courage. And so animas was to live life courageously, but a specific kind of courage, which is to face the truth, own your part of what that means, and act accordingly. And so that's really where I come from. And I studied philosophy when I was a student. In particular, I study the history of ideas. So I've always been fascinated by the degree to which the ideas of any given era shape the way we experience ourselves as individuals, but also experience the society we're in because of the nature of that society. And so I got really fascinated by the bigger question of what enables coaching to exist at all? What do we assume to be possible about human beings, about knowledge, about self-discovery, about action, about freedom, about all these big human issues? What is assumed to be true in the 21st century that enables coaching to be here at all? You know, Socrates had to drink the hemlock because he tried to engage in dialogue, and it kind of pretty much got stymied ever after until quite recently. So I was kind of fascinated by that idea of like what needs to exist today, and so that's really what I'm exploring.
Oh, I love that. One of the ideas of our time, I would say, is definitely transformation. And this was what Simon pointed out in his post as well. The use of the word only really started being spread around in the 21st century. 20th century, 1960, there was a big leap. But nowadays, everybody seems to be talking about transformation. And it means so many different things to so many different people. It's a bit like spirituality. When I explored that academically, it seems that there is some theory there, but people use it in a way that it could just mean anything for anybody, and people just use it in any way they like. And I really appreciate the perspective that you're coming in with, which is let's look at the ideas behind it, and let's figure out what this is grounded in, so that it can have some solid standing and a frame of practice and how we apply it. So I appreciate that. But first I want to ask you, well, why now? I mean, it is an idea of our time, but is there anything else behind why you wanted to put a more solid frame around what you mean when you say transformative coaching?
A few things. I think even as I'm developing my ideas, I can look back at myself as a coach and go, oh, wow, it was always there. Like, it's really interesting. I read a blog post I wrote years ago called The Myth of Omnipotence. And it was to do with the idea that in coaching, we assume that one can do anything, broadly speaking, and reason. And my point in that blog post was, but there's a system that we exist in which constrains us in different ways, and that we can't take that for granted, that doesn't have a big impact on us. But I wasn't a systemic thinker back then. Somehow I just had this sort of awareness of the limitations of being human. And then, so it's interesting historically to look back at myself as a coach and go, oh, interesting. It was always bubbling, but I'd never taken the time to really go, what is it? What do I mean by it specifically? What do I mean by transformation? And what do I mean by, transformative coaching? Because I used to call it transformational coaching. And it was a very deliberate change to move from transformational coaching to transformative. We can talk about that. And then recently, my wife went on a yoga retreat, and there was a coach who was part of that retreat that was meant to work with the clients, and he called himself a transformational coach. But his experience was going to India on a meditation retreat. That was his experience that led him to be a transformational coach. He had no training. And it struck me that the terminology transformational coach is something that's getting picked up by anyone. I don't have a problem with that, by the way. Like, it's not for me to dictate what people call themselves at all, but I want to distinguish myself and my school. And so I just thought, wow, this whole transformational term is becoming so loose and meaningless that I need Animas to have something definite it can lock itself to, because it matters to me. So this isn't about saying, oh, those people over there, they're not really transformational. He might be amazing. I don't know. But I need to know what Animas stands for specifically. So that was really the kind of the genesis. It was both historically maturing as a thinker myself, and then noticing the current trend of everything being transformational and going like, well, that's not helping us have an identity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's important to mention that from the start, that we don't want to take the term transformative coaching or transformation away from other people and doing their thing about what it means to them. Because it's kind of part of the model. Me knowing the model already is that, it starts with the experience of how people make their own meaning, and that's true for them. Right. So let's explore what's true for you then. And I wonder what would be a good starting point into this.
Maybe the shift from transformational to transformative, which was a very recent and very deliberate step, which we took this year. We renamed our course Transformative rather, instead of transformational, and that could be interesting. So first of all, what do we mean by transformational? Well, if you think about, everyone uses the butterfly, right, as a sort of a symbol of transformation. And I remember reading this years ago, and I don't know how true it is, but apparently when the caterpillar becomes a butterfly, it literally dissolves into complete goop and reforms as another kind of animal. And there was even discussion at one point that perhaps it was two species that were somehow cohabiting the same material but with different DNAs. I don't know how true that is, but there's something about the response that the word transformation gets that I think is about that somehow when I hear Simon Weston or anyone else talk about transformation, they have this sort of a reaction against it because it seems too grandiose. And I get it. Like I get the idea that who do these coaches think they are? They're going to turn somebody from a caterpillar into a butterfly, and in the process, they've got to turn them into goop and then completely reform them. That's not what we are thinking about, at least not at Animas. And a much better version is the concept of transformative, which comes from Jack Mezirow's work, which is transformative learning. And there was a beautiful chapter, which you might have read in the book I know you recently bought, called Learning as Transformation by Robert Keegan, where he asks a very simple question, which is, what is the form that transforms? And the form is simply the perspective we have on something. It isn't becoming a goopy mess, reformulating our DNA and becoming something entirely different. It's simply reconfiguring a perspective on something that is currently a problem for us or that we have to engage with in some way. So transformative is much less grandiose in my mind than perhaps it is in other people's minds. I feel like it's something about how do we take a different perspective on something such that our understanding around that thing fundamentally changes.
Right.
It isn't just like, oh, it turns out I can get from there to there quicker. That's not transformation. But realizing that thing you're going to head towards is not what you thought it was, or the journey's not what you thought it was, could be a very transformative experience.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, performance is a thing that helped, and coaching can really, really be very efficient as a tool in helping somebody perform or do things differently. But doing things differently doesn't mean that you have transformed.
Right.
You're just doing things differently. So here, the change isn't one where we completely dissolve and a completely new human being emerges that is different in every way, shape, or form. It's a significant change as in your paradigm. Can you say a bit more? You put it beautifully the other day. I can't quite get the words together again.
I'm trying to remember what I said. I said something about it being, I don't remember, but I said it was essentially a perspective shift on a given paradigm.
I got it here. A change of perspective within a paradigm structure.
Yeah. That's all it is. And by the way, when I talk about this, it's not like that kind of change is better than a different kind of change. It's not like, oh, well, transformative change is so much more profound and so much more important than simple performance change. No, it might be that performance change is all that's needed for a given outcome in somebody's life. The question is it transformative? It might transform their experience of the world, and that might therefore have a byproduct effect of transformation. But the transformative approach to coaching is a deliberate unpicking of the paradigm that somebody is operating from that's causing the experience of the world. So I think of this as a sort of chronology of change. We could coach somebody from a performance level, which might be an entirely appropriate way to do it, which creates a change. And that change then has a ripple effect that creates transformation. That doesn't make it transformative coaching. It's only transformational by accident. Whereas if you are deliberately unpicking the paradigm that person's operating from, then you're being deliberately transformative. And it might not even have a transformative outcome.
Yeah, exactly. So you might help somebody to coach them on changing their behavior. And as a result, they're happier as a person. Right. And some of their paradigm shifts about what happiness means. But transformative coaching would start with, what does happiness mean to you? What is the experience of it? And really starting to unpick what that paradigm is. Did I get that right?
That's how I see it. I mean, it's interesting. I don't think there's any right or wrong in any of this stuff. It's just that we have to figure out, words are symbols for concepts. That's all they are. And transformative is just another symbol for something. And the something is a symbol for me is this idea that we all operate from paradigms that limit our way of seeing the world. And that could be a small paradigm. what do I think about podcasts is a kind of a micro paradigm. What do I think about relationships is a much bigger version of that paradigm. And what do I think about life is a much, much, much bigger version of that, of that paradigm. But they're all fundamentally paradigms. And the question is, to what extent is that particular person's paradigm shaping their experience of the world? And that's why I'm so hot on phenomenology. Like for me, I don't care what's true or false. I care about what that human being's experience is, because that's the starting point. If we don't, if we're trying to figure out what's actually true and what's actually false and what's actually right and what's wrong, we're not going to get anywhere, because it's the client's experience, their lived experience, which is the most important thing for how they're going to move forward in the world. And that's all we're looking at is, let me help you understand you better through what it is that you're processing here.
Yeah. Phenomenology sits at the center of your model. And for those on YouTube, we'll show the model later on. For now, if you're listening to this, we kind of describe it, but we don't need to describe it to say this is at the center, at the heart of it. Yeah. So you touched on it a little bit. Could you say a little bit more about why that's important and how does it look like in practice?
Yeah. It's fascinating. It's all connected. So one of the other principles is systemic and holistic. And I think that's just as relevant. It's just that the subjective experience is at the center of it all, but the subjective experience will be massively influenced by the system that somebody's in. And so therefore, if we ignore the system they're operating within, then we're going to ignore what's creating their subjective experience. But at the heart of it, when I'm coaching somebody, or when you're coaching somebody, Yannick, we're dealing with a human being who's experiencing the world through themselves, right? Through their eyes, through their ears, through their mouth, through their thinking, everything else. And anything they experience is theirs. Now, that could be shaped by the system they're in, but it's still theirs. So if change is going to happen, we've got to help them understand themselves first in some way, understand how they're thinking, how they're feeling, what they're assuming to be true, what they're assuming to be false, what's important, yada, yada, yada. And it doesn't matter a jot what I think is true or what I think is important. It just doesn't matter at all. Because until that becomes part of their world experience in some shape or form, it's not going to create change for them. And so the first starting point is, who are you in some very real sense? And I don't mean that we start off a coaching session with, who are you? I don't know if you ever saw that anger management with Jack Nicholson, where they're in therapy and he says, like, who are you? And he says, well, I'm a such and such. No, that's your occupation. Who are you? And he starts saying, well, I'm a happy-go-lucky. And he's like, no, that's your personality. Who are you? Like, I don't mean that kind of thing. I just mean, what's your lived experience around this thing we're talking about? I don't care if somebody has a faith. I don't care if somebody has no faith. I don't care about anything other than how does that shape their experience of the thing they're trying to achieve or the thing they're trying to overcome.
Right. So it's in the context of what somebody came into the coaching for. I think that's what makes it different to therapy. We just don't just go.
Right.
That there is a focal point to why we're here and why we're unpicking this.
Yes.
And it's important that we bracket, to use a technical term, we kind of suspend or try to forget for some time at least about what we think we know about people and the world. And it's so tempting, I think, for coaches. It's, in my experience, it's the hardest part for new coaches to come in and listen to somebody and resist the temptation to make sense of what they're telling you within the paradigms that you have.
Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about what helps coaches do that?
Yeah, I just wrote a blog post on this 7 levels of judgment and non-judgment, and the top level, which I've never met in anyone, is absolute non-judgment, and the levels beneath that are embodied non-judgment and conscious non-judgment. And I think it's a journey. I think a new coach, typically, unless they've had other kinds of training like therapy, a new coach has to go through a process of conscious non-judgment, where they're going, right, I must bracket this, and it's a conscious, deliberate action to say, I think I know the answer here, but it's not my job to, so therefore I'm going to bracket my assumptions, or whatever word they use for it. I think after a long enough period of time, you actually realize, actually, this stuff I know isn't helpful anyway. It can be. I mean, I've heard a lot of your podcasts, Yannick, where you've been kind of really wrestling with this challenge. And I think there are certain contexts where you know things that are useful. And then it's like, well, is coaching the right approach here? You know, actually, am I really a mentor, and is that okay? But I think where you are a coach, then over a period of time, you would enter what I would call the embodied state of non-judgment, which is you just know you don't know. You actually realize that your knowledge is insufficient and inaccurate, and it's unique to you, and it's incredibly limited and fallible, because you're just a human being that's had your own, shaping done to you. And I think you genuinely realize that, rather than you actively have to put aside what you think you know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I see that as coaches mature, they learn through experience that whatever they think is going on here is limited in how helpful it can be.
Right.
Unless you agree and the client also agrees that that's what they're looking for. Sometimes somebody approaches a coach and they just want their perspective on how things work. And that's okay. It's a very different style of coaching.
Yeah. And by the way, like once you, this is how I see it, at least, Yannick, is that once you really embody non-judgment, then all of a sudden you can actually share your thoughts, because there's an intention behind them, which is not about being right or trying to persuade. You're just sharing your thoughts. And that's different from, and by the way, I'm not talking about proactively sharing your thoughts, but often somebody in coaching might say to me, like, what do you think, Nick? And I'll be like, well, here's what I think, but it doesn't make it right or wrong. And I'll often preface it in some kind of way. And somebody recently said to me, well, that's always your position, isn't it, Nick? This was it was actually on an interview I was doing with somebody recently. And they said, well, that's always your position, isn't it, Nick? You don't know anything. I said, absolutely, it's my position. I mean, it's so in my DNA now. But the weird thing is, it's quite liberating, because that means you're more able to share stuff, because you're so unattached to it being right or wrong.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, you can see that with coaches. Often coaches go through a transformational or transformative journey as they do their coach training from this perspective. Because they, at some point, something clicks and their paradigm shifts, and they experience the transformative element of the learning, which is, oh, I get it now. And some feel it in their body. For some, it's a click in the head, but there's something that shifts, and all of a sudden you are that coach that understands that they don't need to know the answers. And how liberating is that?
So let me pick this up, because what you've done there beautifully is highlight the difference between transformative and, let's say, procedural or behavioral within a change process. So for instance, if you think about what we've been talking about so far, what is transformative? And we've said, well, transformative is a change of perspective on a particular paradigm. Well, the particular paradigm that I think coaching is most fundamentally predicated on is an epistemological one. What is our relationship to knowledge and knowing? And when a coach has to bracket their assumptions and their beliefs, they haven't really transformed yet, because deep down they still believe that their knowledge is useful, and that they're having to procedurally bracket that. And so they haven't transformed. They're in a state of behavioral shift. Whereas once they go like, oh my goodness me, my knowledge really is not useful, or at least it only has partial usefulness, that's a proper transformation, because their perspective on knowledge has changed fundamentally. So there's been an epistemological shift there, and that's transformation in action then.
Yeah, I'm smiling because just yesterday I was on another podcast, and the host had asked me the question, when is that point that you notice somebody has really changed and shifted? And that's exactly what I said, at that moment where you don't have to make a conscious effort anymore to do things differently. It just happened, and you reflect back on it and you're like, oh, I've changed, right? I've transformed, because I didn't have to make a conscious effort to bracket what I think I know, because I am this person now.
Exactly. Yeah.
On
that note, one of the distinctions Jack Mezirow makes around transformative work is this idea of what he calls epochal change and incremental change, or epochal transformation and incremental transformation. And I think that's a useful distinction, because I think a lot of the other, we talked about the reactions that some coaches have to this word transformation. And I think there's something about the absoluteness of it, the almost like St. Paul falling off his horse moment of epiphany, and like life is never the same. Typically, that's not how transformation happens. It's a slow, loosening of the ties that bind us to beliefs and so on. And then it's like, oh, where did they go? We don't even notice they dropped away. We just slowly emerge into a different way of thinking about something, whether that's other people or relationships, that whatever it might be. And I think most transformation is incremental rather than this epochal, bang kind of thing.
I love that you say that, because I think way too many coaches put themselves under this pressure to fulfill this narrative of transformative coaching, which is this huge shift, ideally within the session, right? So you can see the client shift and become this butterfly in the moment.
Yeah.
And it just most of the time doesn't happen like that. Often, actually, clients can't quite pinpoint when it happened. And it's so fascinating to me to sit there and hold a place where a client can reflect on how things went and how they were being. And then they're like, oh, and then you start celebrating, because they realize in that moment that they had changed, not in that moment, but a while ago. And now they realize that had happened.
Yeah. Didn't even realize it. It's funny. I know you're interviewing Peter Hawkins coming up soon. And, Peter often talks about making the transformation happen in the session. And again, this is about what do we mean by transformation. I suspect Peter means something very different by transformation happening in a session that I'm talking about here. But I there's something here about trusting the process and also not having to see the end results. And I remember coaching somebody years ago, very, very successful banker. At the time, he was earning so much compared to me. I just couldn't believe that he was being coached by me. It was quite funny.
Yeah.
But he really wanted to transform his life entirely. And he wanted to do something very spiritual. And we had this really lovely classic 6-session coaching kind of contract. And of course, nothing much changed for him in that time. But I interviewed him recently, like probably about a month, 2 months ago. And I still have the video of the interview I did with him. And he'd reached out to me just out of chance. He now runs a retreat out in the Himalayas. And he's just doing this amazing spiritual retreat. And I said to him, I said, Rajiv, it's amazing that the change we are seeking can take a long time to happen, and we don't get to see it as coaches necessarily happening.
Yeah.
But as good old Irvin Yalom says, every contact leaves a trace. And so you have to trust as a transformative coach that what you're doing is unpicking threads and knots that might take a long time to show up in the life. And Rajiv initially he wasn't offended, because he's not the kind of guy that gets offended. He was like, I don't think it took that long, Nick. I said, no, Rajiv, I don't mean it took a long time. But it's interesting how we think it should happen in the coaching. Yeah. But actually, that kind of life shift is a multi-year journey, not a 6-session journey.
Yeah, so not even within the time that you spend from the beginning to the end of the session.
Right.
Not even often in the time from the first to the last session and after. And how many coaches do sit with us in supervision who are like, oh, I don't know if I've helped this person, we haven't really seen the shift, they haven't done their homework, or, I haven't seen the action being put in place. And then they doubt their approach. Yeah. And I think it's important we ask ourselves these questions. When there isn't progress and the client wanted progress, but it's not always up to you, right? This is co-created. This is not always up to the coach. We're sowing seeds.
I think in particular, where you have clients who want a relatively speedy change, transformative work isn't always the right type. Mm-hmm. I'm a huge fan of the concept of outside in and inside out. I think the therapy world for a long time spent too long, in a sense, on the inside out bit. And what coaching was so good at, especially in the early years, was like, forget that stuff. Let's do outside in. Let's get the behavioral shift and the outcomes happening in the real world. And then we'll figure out what we need to learn. And that has real value. And I think the risk is we can fall too far back to the inside out stuff. Yeah. I've always tried to blend an outside in, inside out approach, which is like, if you can get the result now by doing something out over there without having to change your paradigm, go do. Because sometimes that's all you need to do. Yeah. But when somebody's talking about changing the meaning of their life, that's not going to happen by a simple action somewhere outside in the world. That's definitely an inside thing. So there's something about knowing what the contract is. And I use that contract word loosely, but something about what are we really doing here? Are we on the right page together by doing this kind of work?
Yeah, and it beautifully shows once more that it's not that one approach is better than another, and there's actually good research on this. It depends on context. There was this huge, BetterUp had a huge fallback recently because they changed a few things around how they do things, big outcry from the coaching community. One of the things that really concerned me was that they asked for feedback directly after the session from the clients. They could rate you in sort of a Starbucks kind of way. It's like, was this great, amazing, or life-changing? Yeah. And based on that, you would put into certain categories as a coach, and it kind of puts the coach under the pressure to perform within that session. But then now I'm thinking, well, that does do some work and it does do some good. It's just, I think it's limited. and it puts a certain pressure on the coach and on the client that isn't particularly helpful, but it's certainly not conducive to transformative work. But also they're probably not really aiming at that. Otherwise they would do it differently. So I think it's important that we appreciate that there's different approaches for different aims.
Yes, I agree with that, Yannick. The only thing is I wouldn't necessarily assume that the people making those decisions understand how coaching works. I'm not saying they don't. They might do. I've got no idea who's making that decision, but you might, often with large organizations, which BetterUp is becoming, you have the creeping kind of curse of managerialism. And it might be that the people making those kinds of decisions aren't actually coaches, or they've done, I've got no idea. I just know that sometimes those perverse sort of decisions aren't made by the people who should be making them.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine that, let's say. Yeah. But hey, in the interest of time, I'd love for you to, you mentioned a couple of lenses, right? So phenomenology sits kind of at the center to really appreciate and start from the experience of the client. You mentioned systemic. Yeah. What else is there?
Let me walk you through them super quickly, because you're right, the time is flying by, isn't it? So they're really, from an Animas perspective, this is not a universal model, it's mine. There are 5. Oh, there we go. There are 5. And at the heart is the client's lived experience, which is the phenomenological lens. And then you have this is really, really critical, the humanistic lens. This is one that basically assumes that all human beings have a self-actualizing tendency, and our job is to get out of their way, but to create the conditions for them to see themselves anew. And there's a lot of other stuff within the humanistic tradition that is important to this, but the fundamental one is our belief in the inherent ability for people to self-actualize, to grow, to change, to realize what they want, and all that kind of stuff. So that's like an underlying, what in philosophy is called the axiology of our approach, which is the study of the value base of the work we do. So the humanistic part is the values part. Then you've got the psychological dimension, which is that really, if there's no psychological shift, there's no transformative shift. It's almost like in this model, that's the tautological bit. It's the sort of like, when you say one, you say the other. If I would say transformative work is psychological, I'm just doing tautology. I'm just saying one word equals to the same word. It basically means that there's got to be some psychological shift in order for transformative work to happen. And there are various psychological schools that lend a more transformative approach, but fundamentally, it's about the idea it's got to happen inside. Holistic and systemic is really key, which is to recognize, that the human being is not just a brain on a stick. They are a holistic biological body, which means that as a transformative coach, we can work with other dimensions to them, the somatic dimension and the spiritual dimension and whatever else feels important to them phenomenologically. But, and this is really, really critical, I think at least, the systemic lens balances the humanistic lens, because the humanistic can be very individualistic, as in we assume that the individual can do anything they want. And the truth is, we live in systems that constrain us and support us. And if we don't recognize the power of the system we're in, then we're going to sort of set somebody up for failure. So let's figure out what system is operating, and also what system am I in as a coach? What do I take to be true? That means I'm not challenging somebody in an appropriate way, or I'm challenging them in an inappropriate way. And then the final part is the integrative lens, which is fundamentally...
Sorry, can I just jump in there briefly, because we have phenomenology at the center. For those of you who are listening to this, phenomenology is at the center, and then we have an inside circle with holistic and systemic, humanistic and psychological, and then embedded is the integrative.
The integrative is kind of like the thing that it's like, where does the rubber hit the road? And so it's, how do we operate as coaches? What do we do? And so in a sense, those 4 internal values encounter the world through the integrative approach of what are the methodologies we use. And I've never been somebody that holds any particular methodology as better or worse, more or less true. All I care about is it useful? However...
And so when you say methodology, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, for instance, you could take... I've never cared whether somebody uses any particular approach, such as transactional analysis or Gestalt or existential or personal construct approach or NLP or any of the other stuff. It's like, that's just the methodology. And that's what I mean by the integrative lens. However, just to nuance that, what I do think matters is it's more than just merely eclectic. And I make quite a strong distinction here between eclecticism and integrative approach. The integrative approach is based on a bedrock of the internal theory of transformative work and the purpose of that transformative work, which is to, what Mezirow would call, emancipate us from the systemic thinking that we might be part of. And so if the methodologies we use don't fundamentally achieve that, then they're not transformative methodologies, in my book. Doesn't mean we can't use them, doesn't mean they're not good models, but I wouldn't call them transformative methodologies if they're not emancipating somebody from the system that is governing their paradigm when they first come into the coaching room.
Right. So, for example, let's take one of the popular criticisms of positive psychology, as you know, that's part of my background is in there, is that we can take positive psychology tools and interventions and apply them in a performance-based way or apply them in a transactional way that are not really aimed at that kind of transformation, because we're not grounding them or aiming them or working with what you described at the center, you know. But if we take parts of those tools, I mean, working with strength can be a beautiful way into a conversation about who you are as a person and your experience as a human being. But it really depends how it's being used.
Yes. Yeah, totally. I think in a sense, anything can be transformative. The question, I suspect, the question then is it being used transformatively such that it would fit my model? You know, you could use any model any way you want, and it doesn't have to be transformative. But if I'm going to say, oh yeah, that fits my model, then it's like, well, how has it been used to fundamentally help somebody think through and critically reflect on their paradigm? And if it's not, then it's not transformative, but it's perfectly good at what it does. That's not a critique of it. It's just not what I would call transformative at that point.
Yeah. And we talked about eclectic and integrative, and I gotta bring in an example that my friend Nash Popovich often uses. You know Nash as well. Yeah. He talks about gin and tonics and tequila slammers, you know, as in eclectic being, well, you use different parts sometimes after each other, but there isn't really that kind of connection between them necessarily. It's like, you know, first it's first the salt, and then the tequila, and then you bite into the lemon. My Mexican wife would turn in a grave, I wanted to say. Hopefully not. Please, for many
don't let that happen yet.
Any good Mexican who's dead would turn in their grave. That's not how you drink good tequila. Don't do it. But, you know, it's one after the other. And then there's gin and tonic, where you mix it. Right? You mix things together and they become one. So whatever methodology you used is integrated and becomes one with the process that you're describing. And I'd love to circle back to Jack Mezirow and the process that he describes in a moment. I wonder if there's anything else. I mean, to me, it makes a lot of sense, but also I've kind of worked through your lectures already. I wonder if there's something else that's missing here as we're describing this.
Well, you said we'd circle back to Jack Mezirow, and I think that might pick up on those things anyway. But I suppose if I haven't communicated it well enough, then I think it's worth reiterating what I think transformative is, because we've done a lot of talk, right? And so let's kind of just get the fundamental right. For me, transformative is the act of helping somebody critically reflect on the paradigm that is shaping how they experience life. So when I look at those 5 dimensions of my model, that's what they're all about.
Experience life, or any aspect of life that they come to the coaching to work on.
Whatever they bring. Exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah. And often what they bring to the coaching, you know, they always say how you do one thing is how you do anything. I don't believe in any absolutes. And so therefore I don't say that's true, but I suspect there's some truth in that. And so what they bring to the coaching might also, you know, reflect in other aspects of the life. And I used to talk about coaching as a fractal, the fractal nature of coaching, because what often gets presented in coaching is often a fractal of what's happening in the life in a more general sense. So I suspect the paradigm is something that would be broader than what's initially brought in. But I just wanted to kind of come back to that central point. That transformative is simply critical reflection on a paradigm that shapes how somebody experiences life. And my 5 bits are simply how I've made sense of how we might think about that. But they could be absolutely tossed out and something new come in without affecting my underlying sense of what transformative is.
That's the beauty. And for me, I found this in the existential philosophy. It allowed me to integrate tools and techniques and questions and other methodologies that I come across and build them into something that grounded me in my practice and as a human being. So I think that's why it's so important that coaches out there ask questions about what my foundation is. Because I see a lot of coaches who follow a methodology, but don't find something to ground that in. Right. There was a brilliant, just referring back to positive psychology, there was a brilliant article soon after the whole movement started. Lazarus called it a movement without legs, because it lacked that kind of foundation back in the day. And you're offering a foundation for transformative coaches, which is, why I'm so excited about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a bit snakeist, though. I will say, I think,
snakeist.
To say that something doesn't have legs is a bad thing is very anti-snake.
Yeah, I apologize out there I'm sure there's a term for, snake fans. Okay, great. Well, let's talk about Jack Mezirow a little bit more. He described a process for learning as transformation, and I'll let you describe the way that you see it connect to coaching. Coaching obviously is a form of learning. I would say obviously it's definitely to me. How did Jack inspire that framework that you've built here?
Yeah. Great question. Funnily enough, I only discovered Jack Mezirow in any real meaningful sense relatively recently. I'd heard of him, but never really read his work. And I went on holiday in February and I read one of his books, Learning as Transformation, one of his edited books, rather than most of it's different people. And I was really blown away. What I really like about Mezirow is a couple of things. Number one, he didn't write much. He was a genuine learner. And I think, the problem I've always had with books, not books per se, I love reading, but with writing a book, and I wrote a number of books for my coaching school, but I felt they fossilized my ideas. It was like, now I've written this book, it's like, wow, it's there in black and white. And it's like, it's going to hold me back in some way. And I have a feeling that Jack Mezirow felt that because he only wrote one book on his own sort of back, so to speak. And the rest were edited versions, which typically came from conferences where there was a lot of dialogue happening. So a lot of the work around transformative learning, as Jack Mezirow called it, is a much more dialogic process of a community of learners and thinkers and people figuring out as they go. And what I loved about Mezirow's approach was he was always open to be challenged. In fact, he was willing. He willed people to challenge. He would say, "Here's my thinking, but what's wrong with it? Where do I need to think differently about it?" And I loved that. It was a constant learner. I wish he'd written more for my sake, but I can completely understand from his perspective why he didn't, because he didn't want to fossilize his knowledge. But his fundamental concept was that at some point in life, or many points in life, we encounter what he called a disorienting dilemma. And this is a challenge to something we think is true in our life. It could be something very small, but it fundamentally makes us go, hold on, how can that be? And that could be a very small thing, or it could be a huge thing, but it makes us kind of, I don't know how to deal with this. And then we have to start to really critically reflect on what we think to be true. And then he describes a 10-stage process of coming to transformative learning. And what I noticed is that these 10 stages, oh, you've got a slide, that's lovely. Yeah, there we go. What I noticed was these 10 stages actually map quite nicely to the 3 levels of coaching. And so those first 5, disorienting dilemma, self-examination, critical assessment of assumptions, recognition that others have shared similar transformation, and exploration of new possibilities, roles, and actions, all of that fitted into the transformative block. And the next 3, develop a plan for action, acquire the knowledge and then skills, and try out the plan, are unbelievably in line with the performance approach to coaching. And then the final ones, development of competence and self-confidence, and reintegration into one's mental map into life on a new basis, map into developmental coaching. I was like, wow, thanks, Jack. You've given us this beautiful 10-stage process of human individual change that maps into these 3 levels of coaching we recognize. And so to my mind, I feel like I'm still on a journey of figuring this stuff out, Yannick. Like, I don't pretend that Jack and I have met, he's now dead, but I don't believe the ghost of Jack has visited me and shared all this with me. I'm figuring this out, and there's a lot that I need to learn, particularly around the wider aspects of this. I'm about to embark on a master's in psychosocial studies, because one of the things I realized is there's a lot about the background to emancipatory learning that is very new to me. And I feel like as a working class kid, which is, I still feel in my heart, I'm a working class kid from Cornwall. And I often feel we don't shake off our childhood in lots of ways. And I feel like there's a lot I need to figure out about how the world works that is going to be new to me. So he's given us this beautiful framework of 10 steps of individual change. We've got these beautiful 3 levels of coaching that map to it. And now I'm like, well, hold on. What sits behind all of that? What's the kind of the psychosocial background to this, which is important for us as practitioners?
Yeah, excellent. And I'd love to go maybe in a little bit of a case study to see how somebody might move through these stages. For those of you who are listening, again, I showed 1 or 2 slides that had taken from a lecture, the first lecture that you've done, which is called An Introduction to Transformative Coaching. So people can find that on YouTube. We'll put the link in the show notes. But let me bring that back up. If you're listening to this, no need to have it in front of you. If you want to, you can pause this and kind of bring it up for you. But I'd love to make this tangible and come alive. So I wonder if you could talk us through maybe a client you've worked with, or something real, so we can figure out, well, what does it mean to have a disorienting dilemma, for example? Let me bring that back up so you have a roadmap with it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example for this. It's funny, I'm going through one myself at the moment, but it's not one I'd want to talk about because it involves other sort of dimensions to my coaching school and so on. But it's fascinating when you encounter a true disorienting dilemma. It's like a disorienting dilemma isn't just something that's tricky. It makes you question what you think you know. So let's try to make one up as we go here. Imagine somebody, their partner has said they want to split up, they want divorce, or they want to split up, and it's all of a sudden you've got this disorienting dilemma where what you thought you knew about your life is no longer appropriate. It doesn't work anymore. So then you've got to go through this from a Mezirowian, is that the right word? I don't know. Mezirowian perspective. You could just go like, damn them, I don't care, and there's no transformation happening. But let's say,
and then you hold on to it, and you find yourself most likely in a similar relationship with a similar outcome.
Exactly. So you choose not to learn from your relationship. I was going to say failures. It's not failure, but relationship feedback.
Yeah. Hold on, Nick. Just one question as we are there. Does it have to be completely disorienting, dizzying, questioning the foundations of who you are?
No,
or could it just be
for the particular aspect of the paradigm you're experiencing?
Right. So, for example, when I'm thinking, well, I might have gotten the criticism at work when I had the self-image of I'm amazing and I don't fail, I don't do things wrong, or I pick things up very quickly and all of a sudden something takes longer. It feels like, ooh, I'm not quite sure. There's a loss of orientation in terms of things are not as clear as I thought they were. Okay, great.
It's a great pickup, actually, because it relates back right at the start of our conversation around transformation and how we can universalize this concept of transformation to be all encompassing, but a disorienting dilemma can be quite small. We have a phrase in Animas called a Julia moment. And it was because years and years ago, when somebody enrolled, we'd send them a letter with bits and bobs, and a customer called Julia said she was disappointed with this. It felt like, having been so excited to get this pathetic little letter through the post, was not what she expected. And at the time, my first reaction was like, this is what we do. But it was disorienting to me, because I was like, we're good school. Like, what's? And then I was like, hold on a sec. And I went through to the next phase of self-examination. Well, hold on, actually, let me put myself in her shoes. And we have this thing called Julia moment, which is where a customer points something out that we then have to look at ourselves and go, actually, yeah, good point. How do I need to rethink this? So disorienting dilemma can be small, can be big, but let's say, you have this relationship breakup. You decide to go on a transformative journey rather than just blame the person or repeat your same old mistakes. So you go through a process of self-examination. That's like, what have I done here? And what happened? And what's my role in all of this? And you really start thinking it through. And then you go through a critical assessment of your assumptions. So it's one thing to look at yourself and go like, what did I do? It's another to think, well, what lay behind that as my beliefs? What were my beliefs, what were my values that led to the behaviors that I just examined? So you start to critically assess your assumptions about the world, or about other people, or about yourself, or whatever it might be.
Which is stage 3.
Stage 3. Stage 4, recognition that others have had a shared similar transformation, is more of a what might you call this? A sort of permission to change. And it's a very systemic approach, because it's like saying you're not alone in this. And so there's something quite important from a human perspective to recognize that this is not a unique thing. This is not your failure. This is a human issue, and others have been there too.
And that's so interesting for coaches, because I hear some debate around, well, you shouldn't validate or bring in other people. Other people don't really matter to the experience of your client in front of you.
Right.
Whereas often we can experience how, when a coach realizes that they're not alone, when the client, a coachee, realizes that they're not alone in this, that other people have gone through this, that maybe the coach might even share that, they have experienced something like that.
Right.
It can have huge effects.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, as a coach, you're not doing this. I mean, by the way, I'm taking Mezirow's 10 stages, and it might not be absolutely directly applicable to coaching, but there's something about the journey that a client will go through where they start to go, okay, this isn't just about me. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean you have to go, oh my goodness, I've got to get to stage 4. How do I help them? No, that's not your job. Your job is to still coach. Yeah. And then the final stage of this first half is exploration of new roles or actions. And this is really opening the mind up to new possibilities. Is what we used to call at Animas the loosen up phase, loosening up the tightly bound beliefs that you have and just going, well, how else might I be? What else might I try on? What else could I believe? And at that point, the transformative phase is sort of opened up. And then you go into the performance phase, which is, okay, develop a plan of action. How might I relate differently? How might I communicate differently? How might I find a partner that's more appropriate for me rather than repeating the same patterns? Whatever it might be that the first phase created, you can then start to go, well, okay, let me try this out. And then it's like, what have I got to learn about myself? What skills do I need to learn? That might be, how do I communicate differently to this person specifically? How do I need to handle conflict differently? You might need to learn, I don't know, what's that approach? Non-violent communication. It might be there's a really important stage of going, okay, how do I communicate in a way that doesn't keep flaring up all the time? And then trying it out in practice. And that's your performance part. Go on a date, or, try speaking to your partner in a different way, whatever it might be. And then finally, it's into the developmental phase, which is, how does it become a part of you? Okay, client, how can you make that more of a lasting part of you? How can you become confident in this new way of being? And finally, how can this just become part of how you think and feel? So I haven't given you a really super concrete example there, but hopefully that's given a flavor of the sort of journey somebody goes on.
Yeah, for sure. Where do we go next, I wonder? Let me check, because I had a number of questions. I think we have a good overview, a good grasp of what sits at the foundation, what are the lenses that influence this, how could it look like in practice, how could a process of transformation look like?
Can I share one? Because
Please,
you
yes.
talk about how could it look in practice, and one of the things that I've often been accused of as a coach is being too abstract. And I talked about this in one of my lectures, where I remember doing a supervision course once, and I was supervising somebody, and somehow we ended up talking about the person's father. And at the end, the person observing said, I'm not sure what happened in that session. Something happened, but I'm not sure what. And it wasn't really a compliment, nor was it constructive feedback. It was more like that was weird. And I recognize that sometimes I can be a little bit abstract because I'm not pulling it into a grounded position. And so I think there's something about, how does this look? Well, it looks like you need to, first of all, go into the abstract phase of like, what are the big beliefs here that are floating around, or what are the belief structures that are floating around? But then it's about, okay, what do we do with this in practice? And I think there's a really important thing about going from the big abstract stuff into the concrete. And as a coach, how you do that might differ, but I think it's important that as coaches, we do that. I remember going to therapy some years ago. It was one of my phases where I was bad at relationships. And I've often been bad at relationships, but I went through a particular phase. And so I went to a therapist. And what would happen is we would go through the classic 50-minute session, and then it was just finished.
And now what? What do I do with this?
It was literally no sense in which we're like, oh, okay, so this is what I could do. It was like, okay, time's up. And I was left with the floatingness of it all.
Yeah.
And I think what coaching needs to do differently, I believe, is say, well, that's great. What does this mean?
How do we pull it in?
Concretize it in some way.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it can be really helpful when things are up in the air, that a client has some time to process. And
Right.
sometimes my sessions at least, end with, I'm hesitating to ask you how we pull this in, because I have a sense that there's a lot out that just needs to be processed and we're out of time. But I trust my client to be able to process this and then see what comes back. But I think that's often why therapy can get a bad rap, right? Because people leave too often in this floaty state where it stopped, and it's up to them to make sense of it.
I suppose so. I guess that's about the contracting. I think if you understand that's how it works, it's fine. I also think, if you truly believe in the client's ability to self-actualize, then leave them floaty. But I think as coaches, we are looking to at some point become more concrete. And when you're talking about this idea, there's a lot to process. The question you might typically ask with 5 minutes to go is something like, what sense are you making of this? So it's not like you would in the therapy sessions, it would just suddenly be like, she'd look at the watch and go, okay, that's our 50 minutes. And there was no sense of pulling the threads together. Whereas even a simple question like, what sense are you making of this, can make you go, it's been fascinating. And here's what I'm doing with these ideas.
Yeah. Or what are you going to do in order to make sense of this? What's the rest of the day look like, or week, or, what's your intention to do with all of this stuff that's on the table now? So we're not tempted to fall back into old patterns and just kind of forget about what just happened.
Yeah. There's something else that just came to mind. I'm aware of time, but you were asking where could we go? And there's something else I think is useful, which is the distinction between what I would call behavioral level beliefs and paradigm level beliefs. And I think, for instance, that, cognitive behavioral coaching can be phenomenally powerful at shifting beliefs, but I consider them to be the gateway into transformative work rather than transformative work in their own right. And again, I might be wrong on that. There might be CBC and CBT practitioners out there going, "Boo, here's Nick Bolton," and burning torches at me and stuff. Like, I totally get it. But my feeling is that often CBC and let's stick with CBC, cognitive behavioral coaching, often works at what I would call the conscious beliefs that we are really in tune with that are causing us problems. And actually, when I think of transformative, it's what are the unconscious beliefs that come from the system we inhabit, hence the emancipatory principle, because it's emancipating us from the deeper belief structures that we don't even know we hold. And so I kind of think that the CBC allows us the glimpse into, well, that's the belief. Where's that belief come from? And you have different levels of belief, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it almost doesn't matter so much what's the entry point. I think we can go from something quite concrete into the abstract and then back to the concrete. Or we could start with something that's quite abstract and, some free association with things coming up. And then we start making sense of it and making it more concrete. But what I appreciate about coaching is that we try to pull these threads together. We try to help somebody get more clarity and essentially move forward with something, either whether that's doing something differently, being something different, being somebody different. We're integrating, right? So I think that surface level work, or not that cognitive behavioral is surface level, but it opens so many doors. There's so much potential to dive into who this person is. And I think sometimes it's just limited when we only work with the cognitive or the behavioral. It can lead to transformation as a byproduct, as we said earlier. But it's too easy for clients sometimes to just kind of leave it there. And if we don't add those extra bits, that extra go through that door of transformation, often the results, they don't last. So we can have quick results, but they don't last very long.
And it depends what the results you're trying to get are, because it might be quick results is all you need. There are certainly lots of areas of my life where it's been external outcomes that have changed my experience of life. Financially, for instance, I'm a much happier person by being financially liberated than when I was constantly in debt and unable to pay my bills. And, that external change of reality is enormously important to me. And that's not a transformative thing. It's a transformative outcome, but it wasn't a paradigm shift for me. It was an external situational shift. And so, again, I want to be really, really clear here. This is not a qualitative evaluation of things. It's just recognizing what each pocket brings.
Yeah, great. I have a question around, because we talked about making sense, making meaning. I found this Jack Mezirow opens that book, Learning is Transformation. I just wanted to read it out to people because I thought it was beautiful, and I thought, I have a question around that. He writes, a defining condition of being human is our urgent need to understand and order the meaning of our experience, to integrate it with what we know, to avoid the threat of chaos. If we are unable to understand, we often turn to tradition, thoughtlessly seize explanations by authority figures, or resort to various psychological mechanisms such as projection and rationalization to create imaginary meanings. And he then goes on to describe meaning making as a learning process. Is coaching a meaning making process? And what else is there? Or is it just about helping somebody make different meanings in order to get to that shift? It seems to be a crucial component of it, but I wonder what's beyond.
Oh, that's a big old question. So there's two fundamental questions there. Is coaching about meaning making? And I think you said, is that all there is?
Mm-hmm.
I think, which is an interesting phrase in itself, isn't it? Like, is that all there is, making meaning? I absolutely think coaching is about making meaning, but it doesn't have to be as complex as we think. I think, the risk of this conversation is I love the intellectualization of coaching, but that doesn't mean the practice of coaching has to feel any different. It's like, I'm an intellectual coach. I just like, what are the ideas that need to exist in the world for coaching to happen? But I absolutely think coaching is a meaning-making process, but it's not like we are going, right, now we're into the meaning-making phase. It's like we're always making meaning. The very act of coaching means we're having to look at what we think is true. Mm-hmm. And the whole point of it being transformative is that is what we're looking at. What is our belief system, and how do we then allow that to be useful for us or not useful for us, and make meaning of it, versus a more purely behavioral approach, which is, right, I need to get this outcome in my life, so I need to do this, this, and this. That isn't a meaning-making approach. Mm-hmm. And again, that's not a qualitative judgment. It's just not a meaning-making approach. It's simply a behavioral one. So yes, it's meaning-making, and it can be either meaning-making deliberately or meaning-making as a byproduct or not at all. Mm-hmm. Number one. And I'll share this briefly, because in my blog post on judgment, I talked about, it's funny what Jack Mezirow says about going back to traditional figures, or whatever he said, traditional, because I was thinking about many years ago, I got into reading alternative history, people like Graham Hancock and all sorts of fascinating writers. Mm-hmm. But every book I read was utterly compelling, completely convincing, and yet really, really different from each other. And I was like, well, they can't all be right. And so at some point I gave up and went back to just trusting traditional history that I'd learned at school, and that, you would find in a traditional history bookshelves rather than the alternative section. And only recently have I gone back to those writers with a greater comfort for not needing to know what's true. So there was a process of me being okay with not knowing, but loving the meaning-making process. But not having, but because I needed to know, I was like, oh my God, this is doing my head in. I need to go back to what I'm told is good, which is what the teachers and the professors say, and what Waterstone says on their history bookshelves.
Yeah, I just really appreciate how you are living your principles here, because your coaching school has gone through a couple of evolutions, and you're in the middle of another evolution to really get this built into the core of what you're teaching. So at this point, I think I just want to thank you for doing that work, for offering your thoughts on these ideas and bringing them together, and really investing into packaging them into a format where people can digest them and process them and learn them and go through that transformation as they learn to become a coach, or coaches who come in and they learn to get to the next level of coaching maturity, or coaching approach, and just adding these bits in. I think it has a huge impact on the world when people take this approach out into their relationships, whether that's as a coach or as a human being, as a leader or as any other person in relation.
Yeah.
So thank you. Any last words?
I suppose a cautionary note, really, which is I have a slight concern that this whole conversation could be taken by a coach to mean they've got to do something different. And it really isn't about that. To me, this whole thing is a stance. And I often talk about the difference between directive and directional. And obviously coaching is non-directive, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be directional, as in it follows a certain direction of interest. But at the same time, I don't want anyone to listen to this go, oh no, I've got to be like this. No, this is very much my stance. It's the stance of what I see growing and growing and growing within my coaching school. But I have absolutely no interest in persuading somebody this is a better kind of coaching or any of that sort of stuff. It's just what I'm interested in. So I just want to leave it on that note, I suppose, because there's always a risk that we think we have the next greatest thing, and this isn't the next greatest thing. It's just a thing.
It's just a great thing. And I think we've made that clear, from the start, that there are different approaches for different contexts. And actually, in many contexts, not transformational work is going to work a lot better because it's quicker and it gets to the point, and your client will come back to the second session if you do that. And everybody needs to find their own style. So if any of this resonated, I really, really can't encourage them enough to go and, 6 lectures as talks, you're an engaging speaker, I might add, when you present, even if you read through slides, there's always a lived phenomenological experience and an embedding of your ideas into how this shows up for you. So you said earlier that it's maybe not practical enough, but it's actually very beautifully linked to how it shows up, at least for you, and not claiming that this is the truth. So anybody who resonated with this conversation, go check it out. It starts with an introduction to transformative coaching. And if you go to the Animas YouTube channel, you'll find them all there. So again, thank you for that work. Thank you for your time. And thank you for creating this space so we can talk about it. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Yannick.
See you next time. Bye, Nick.